SpokenTome Media. You need to hear this.
Hi everybody, my name is Mark Jeftovic from SpokenTome Audiobooks, and I'm happy to kick off our second edition of our podcast series with a very illustrious and distinguished guest. I'm talking about the Honorable Paul Hellyer, who's had a great many accomplishments in his career. He had held numerous cabinet appointments through various prime ministers of Canada. He was the Minister of Transport, he was the Minister of Defence, and he was the senior minister in the cabinet, which is akin to today's Deputy Prime Minister under Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the first Trudeau administration. He's the author of numerous books, including Goodbye Canada, The Evil Empire, Globalization's Darker Side, Creating a Wealth Economy, and most recently, The Money Mafia, which is the book that we're making into an audiobook, which should be ready by the time this podcast hits the air. So I'm thrilled to have you on board today for the podcast. Thanks for taking the time.
It's a pleasure.
I just want to dive right in with the actual initial quote that kicks off Chapter 1 of the New World Order chapter of the Money Mafia book, where you quote from Plato that dictatorship naturally arises out of democracy and the most aggravated form of tyranny and slavery out of the most extreme liberty. Can you give us a bit of an expansion on that?
Well, not really, except to say that some of the things that have been going on in the world in recent decades have been transforming what we call democracies into plutocracies or aristocracies, and in a rather, I was going to say, frightening way. I guess maybe that's fair enough. The United States, for example, has for many, many years had two governments, the official government and the shadow government, as it's sometimes called, or the cabal, as I call it in my books. And it's the shadow government that has really been running the United States for a long, long while, so that Congress is often, most of the time, unaware of what the shadow government is doing. And the president, who is supposed to be the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, is often not in the loop as to what, in fact, some of the branches of the armed forces are doing. So this is a case of an autocracy being put together right under the nose of what is supposed to be the greatest democracy in the world, but which in fact has not really been a democracy for many decades. I think going back to the days of Truman, and certainly not after Eisenhower.
And how would you? I would imagine most of our readers might be familiar with the concept of shadow government, but how would you explain the components and the constituent members of the shadow government?
Well, I call first of all, the cabal, which is really running the show. The cabal consists of, first of all, the money cartel, the banking cartel at its apex. They're the kingpins. They really pull the strings, and without them, the thing wouldn't happen. Then next to them is the oil cartel. And then after that, the heads of the transnational corporations, the big transnational corporations. And after that, a very large proportion of the intelligence community, including most, if not all, of the CIA, the FBI, certainly to a considerable extent, the NSA almost 100%, and then the MI6 and the Mossad, Israeli Mossad, and then finally a very large slice of the U.S. military. They are the cabal, and they have been really in charge of the United States and more recently of other parts of the world for decades. And so much so that when was very senior White House correspondent at a press gallery, a press conference by the president, who was then Bill Clinton, was asked why he didn't make more of the ET presence and technology public. He said, Sarah, her name was Sarah McClendon, Sarah, there is a government within the government, and I don't control it. Now, that's a terrible admission for the President of the United States, that in effect, the commander-in-chief, so-called, and the one with the finger on the atomic button, is not always in the loop and is not in control of some very, very significant forces under his command.
Okay. In one of your, I remember you relating that quotation in one of your YouTube videos that I was listening to a little earlier, and in that video, you recorded it during the Obama administration, who I think is sort of followed in the same groove as Clinton and Bush, as his administration was pretty well a linear extrapolation of the first two. Where does Trump fit into all this? Was he a genuine surprise to the cabal, or is he just another branding exercise by it?
I think it's too soon to tell. I think he could exercise some independence, but how much I really don't know, because that's an internal matter in the United States, and he has his work cut out for him. I think the greatest thing he could do would be to dismantle the cabal and work on one of the component part after another. And the first one he should work on is the banking system. And he's made one false move there, I would say, is that he's promised to go along and repeal some of the conditions that had been applied to the banking system by his predecessor after the meltdown in 2007, 2008. And he has said that they're going to review all of those things and presumably make the controls on the banks less onerous. If he does that, then I will think that he is under the control of the banking cartel. If, on the other hand, he were to come suddenly take the bull by the horn and say, we're going to rescind the act which set up the Federal Reserve System. We're going to rescind the Federal Reserve Act that's now about 104 years old, and we're going to establish a proper central bank, call it the Bank of the United States if you want, or anything you want, but one that would be under the direct ownership and control of the government of the United States. Then I would say that would be a fantastic step in the right direction. Not only as far as control is concerned, not only as far as the balance of power between the rich and the poor is concerned, but in making money available to do the things that he says have to be done, like providing jobs for the people who lost jobs when most of the manufacturing, or a lot of the manufacturing industries in the United States moved to Mexico and Far Eastern countries. And the only way you can do that is to have a lot of money available. And if he just borrows it from the richest families in the world, the way the predecessors have been doing, then there's no advantage. And it would just be the same old gang. And this, if I could go back 8 years, even before President Obama was sworn in, I saw a newspaper picture showing his financial advisors. I said, game over, same old gang. So it really depends who he gets around him. This is President Trump. And then what he does. And we'll have to see some positive results, like taking the banks on for size rather than enabling them to make even more money, before we can believe that he's really a reformer and not just another person who makes a lot of decisions in the early days, but then is not really the real broom changing the scene that we were hoping for.
Right. Well, I'm already noticing there seems to be a preponderance of Goldman Sachs alumni being put into pretty important cabinet posts around him, and he hasn't really come out and said what he's going to do at the end of Yellen's term in 2018. So he doesn't look to be moving too quick.
Something that's disturbing. To have someone from Goldman Sachs that close to him is not a good sign.
Indeed, indeed.
We have to watch with interest and hopefully with some anticipation, but we won't know for a while.
Right. Is you're Canadian, I'm Canadian, we're both Canadians. How does the Canadian central banking system differ from the U.S. one? Is our central bank privately owned, or is it a government-owned central bank?
It's entirely different. It is 100% owned. It was formed in 1934 as a public corporation by Prime Minister Bennett, and then there was a member of Parliament by the name of Jerry DeGeer from British Columbia, who really understood the money in banking. Very, very few people do, and very, very few politicians do, but he did. And he had, I guess, some talks with Mackenzie King, probably while he was still in opposition, so that when Mackenzie King formed a government, he nationalized the bank and bought all of the private shares. And today they are all held in trust by the Minister of Finance, held in trust for Canadians because we own that bank 100%. And consequently, we are in a position to do something about our terrible dilemma, which is we haven't got enough money for health care or education or the arts or for infrastructure or for looking after the needs of our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. We need a lot of it, but we haven't access to it. And the Constitution of Canada gives the Parliament at Ottawa absolute authority over money and banking in Canada. And Parliament, not the government, but Parliament, and certainly when you have a majority government, well, you can control Parliament, can create or have the Bank of Canada create all of the money that is needed to fill all of those needs that I just mentioned. And unfortunately, they're not willing to do that because there's a myth that money created by the Bank of Canada is inflationary. Well, that is not true. We had a system for 35 years that got us out of the Depression, helped finance the war, and after the war helped finance all of the infrastructure for most of Canada, including the big St. Lawrence Seaway and the Trans-Canada Highway and the DEW line, the distant early warning line of radar systems that went all the way around the continent. And we paid for the ones in Canada and smaller ones from the provinces and so on, plus later helping to establish a first-class social security system. And this was all paid for by a combination of taxes and Bank of Canada created money, bank created money, not government created money, I should say, and some private borrowing, but very, very little. We did all those things without accumulating any significant debt until 1974, when the Bank of Canada unilaterally, without any advice or consent from the Government of Canada or the Prime Minister, changed the system and started taking its orders from the Bank for International Settlements in Zurich, Switzerland, which, incidentally, is under the control of the banking cartel, under the control of the families that really are calling the shots worldwide. It might interest your listeners to know that 3 years ago, 88 families owned half of all the wealth in the world, A year later it was 80, and this year it's 62. 62 families own half of all the wealth in the whole world. Well, I can't get my arms around or my brain around that because it's almost beyond comprehension. When I'm talking about it, I talk about the cities of Asia, Beijing and Peking and Tokyo and so on, coming across to Vancouver, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and jump across to New York and Toronto and Montreal and Philadelphia and across the pond to London and Manchester and then on to Bonn and other countries. And every second one of those cities is owned lock, stock, and barrel by one of those 62 families, or by the 62 families in total. And it is absolutely wrong. It is an evil result, which has to be resisted, has to be reversed. So that's the reason that I put so much emphasis on government-created money and putting forward to the government a plan which would provide enough money to do all of the things that they have to do. So far, they haven't listened to it because they just say it would be inflationary, which in fact it would not. The evidence during those 35 years when we did have the Bank of Canada creating money for the federal government, a lot of it, our inflation rate was in line with the average of the 15 OECD countries. And you can't do much better than that.
And considering that most governments today, they're complaining that inflation is too low. Not that I even agree with targeted inflation, because I think targeted inflation is, in its sense, I mean, we've heard it, it's called a tax on the poor by some commentators, but
well, this is a big subject which we haven't got time to cover in total. But the important point is that in some respects, government-created money could be less inflationary than the present bank-created money, the banker's monopoly. Because under the banker's monopoly, they create all the money as debt which has to be paid both principal and interest. Nobody creates any money with which to repay either the principal or the interest. So if a country wants to grow, and they all do, or say they do, they need more money because that's the gasoline for the economic engine. If they want to grow, they have to get more money. Taxes are already too high, which is their other source. And borrowing puts the country deeper into debt, and there is no known way to pay it off. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and we will be paying interest on the debt forever, or giving up our assets, letting people take our assets, as they have done in a number of countries, and which I think is probably the game that they're starting with the United States and Canada at the present time. Move in, offer you a lot of money for your infrastructure, do a lot of lobbying, a lot of entertaining, and invest hundreds of billions of dollars in your airports and your ports and other, maybe hydro and so on. And then if you come to the point where you can't pay off the principal, they say, well, we'll just take total ownership of the utility, whatever it happens to be. In other words, to buy up more of Canada's real assets with as little as 5 cents on the dollar, which is the way the banking system works today. They only need 5 cents to create a dollar, and then we have to pay back the dollar plus interest. It is an insane system. It's beyond insane. And something has to be done to set it right, and that's the reason that some of us are working so hard, and the Canadian bankers, Canadian bank reformers have set up a website, and they're trying to raise money and get people educated in this subject, which most people don't understand. And it's also the reason that we're planning to start a court action against the government of Canada if they ratify and and start implementing the CETA agreement, because that, CETA, if it's put into operation, would have control over our ability to use the Bank of Canada the way that we must use it. So in other words, the government can and probably will, if they can get away with it, sell us down the river. But we're going to start a court action to save us from the politicians, and hope that the courts will have more common sense, more concern for the 99% than the government seems to have.
I was going to ask you about that next, because you are quite active on opposing some of these free trade deals that are floating around. I remember we had to postpone this podcast because there was some movement on the CETA front, and you had to, I think you went on a 6-city speaking tour to talk against that. And I guess for a while it looked like CETA would be stalled because the Belgians wouldn't ratify it, but I think they've managed to get past that. So tell me a bit more about the court case. Who are you working with to launch that?
Working with it, there are 3 of us who are plaintiffs, and there's a professor from London, Ontario, and Emmett, the president of Comer, and myself. And we engaged Rocco Galati, who is probably one of the best constitutional lawyers in Canada, to take the case for us. And he prepared and filed, but it was on the basis of the 1,200 and some odd page original CETA document. Well, then the government pulled a fast one and reduced it to 500 or 600 pages and made it a bill in the House of Commons. I think because they realized they might have to have parliamentary approval, or that they should have. So we had to start all over again. And Rocco has to go through all the documents and put on the new page numbers and the new numbers for the paragraphs and all of that sort of thing, and have it ready. We can't file it until the bill has been given royal assent. And that has not yet taken place. I understand they gave it 3rd reading in the House this week, just in February, and that they will send it on to the Senate. But until it passes the Senate and is given royal assent, we can't actually file the case for an injunction, on the basis that the federal parliament does not have the power to do it. That it's ultra virus of their power, because it influences and negates the Constitution of Canada. In other words, it takes away Parliament's own power to run money and banking, and they can't do that without going through the regular process for constitutional change, which I think is you need 6 provinces with a majority of the Canadian people in order to do it. So we're hoping that the courts will say, yes, it's beyond the powers of Parliament, ultra virus, and it's null and void unless and until they amend the Constitution in accordance with the amending procedure for the Constitution.
Well, we wish you good luck on that one. I hope that goes our way. What about, I don't want to keep talking about Trump, but I guess in this day and age it's almost impossible not to. With his executive order to pull out of TPP, do you consider that a victory in the battle against the cabal and the free trade, or not so much?
The TPP, yes. I was wholeheartedly behind that. That's the one thing that he has done that I approve of 100%.
Great. You worked for his father in the first Trudeau administration. What are your thoughts watching the young Justin Trudeau in his first term at bat?
Well, I think he's done a lot of small things that I approve of. It's the big ones that concern me, and I think it's partly because he hasn't had a lot of experience, and partly because he's getting a lot of bad advice. He in Paris, made it look as if he really cared about the future of the planet. And then he comes home and approves pipelines that are not even in the ground yet, in one or two cases, and which require amortization of 25 or 35 years, maybe as long as 50 years to make them worthwhile. And that's going to be years, decades later than is necessary to replace fossil fuels with clean energy if we really want to keep the planet inhabitable for the human species. I say in my book 7 years. That would be the goal as far as I'm concerned. If we did it in 7 years, we could probably salvage a lot, not all, but a lot of the damage that is going to take place around the world with climate change and so on, and give a lot of people a break. But if it takes 20 or 30 or 40 years to convert, I think the damage is going to be so bad, not only irreversible, it's going to be so bad and so widespread that I really have fear for the human species being able to survive. It's that serious. But the politicians are not taking it seriously, and I think that's wrong. Well, then, of course, CETA. We haven't come out ahead on any of the trade agreements so far. We got the short end of the stick with the Canada-U.S. trade agreement. With NAFTA, we lost a lot of our manufacturing, both to the United States and to Mexico. And here they're bringing on another one, which will be even worse, and which transfers more power from the people of Canada to the international banks and transnational corporations. A lot of power, more power than people can really imagine until they've seen it in operation for a while. And it just should never have happened, and we have to do everything we can to see if we can stop it from proceeding beyond the embryonic stage.
It seems to me that a lot of these initiatives have a momentum of their own, an inertia of their own. There's no political will to even enter into public discourse about it. I've suspected for a long time, in the U.S. especially, I've called it a one-party system. Do you think it's like that here in Canada as well?
Well, I think you've already seen evidence that the present government is supporting a lot of the policies of the previous government, including CETA.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that is not reassuring. They're following the same policy of the present government as far as the Bank of Canada is concerned. And that is not reassuring. And they're following pretty well the same policy as far as the oil industry that the previous government followed. And that is not reassuring. So there are three major objections there where they're all in the direction of the more things change, the more they say the same. Excuse me. The more things change, the more they stay the same, as the French say. And it's too bad. Whether we can get through in time or not, I don't know. I'm a congenital optimist, or I wouldn't get out of bed in the morning.
Would it be any different under an NDP administration? I was a little disheartened in the last election that they sort of backed away from certain policies, like overturning the surveillance bill, and I began to suspect that wouldn't really change much under them either.
It might not. You don't know. It depends a lot on the leader. In Alberta, for example, there's been very little change with an NDP government. What national government would do if it was NDP, we have yet to see. I think if Jack Layton had become Prime Minister of Canada, there would have been real change. For example, he understood monetary policy, but just wouldn't talk about it unless he became Prime Minister. But he was the only leader who understood, other than Pierre Trudeau, after he was no longer Prime Minister. I convinced him one day, and he gave me his blessing and Godspeed to do something about it, said I could use his name. But of course, his successors had their own advisors, and they weren't interested in in the old guys and their advice. So nothing happened.
So you're saying the first Trudeau finally understood the perniciousness of the monetary system after he was prime minister?
He did, yes. Yeah.
I mean, I've often remarked to myself that the money system is, as you say, very few people understand it. We had dinner guests over last weekend, and one was a lawyer, the other was a college professor, and somehow the topic came on to the money system and interest and debt-based money, and they had never heard of any of this. And these are highly intelligent people, and I tried to explain to them that, if you put smart people in a room to invent the money system, and they had the best interests of the population in mind, they would not come up with the system we have today. They would not come up with a debt-based private central bank lending money into existence that the state has to pay interest on to use it. It just wouldn't happen that way.
Right. But it was never planned except by the people who benefit from it. It just grew like topsy, and the politicians, unfortunately, were persuaded by one means or another to just let it go. And as you know, we're running out of time, so I'll have to. But 300 years ago, the ratio of the banks, they were allowed to lend the same money twice, ratio of 2 to 1. And then it kept going up. And the early parts of the 20th century in the United States, federally chartered banks had to have 25% gold reserves against deposits, so they could lend the same money 4 times. In Canada, we had to have cash reserves of 8%, so they could lend the same money 12.5 times. And then when monetarism came along and deregulation, American banks were lending as much as 25 or 35 times, and then there were rules imposed to get them down to 20, which is the present ratio. And that is just, it's grand larceny. We can't lend the same money to 20 people and collect interest from each one, and yet that's what the banks do. So in other words, they can buy assets for 5 cents on the dollar. That's the flip side. And that is the reason those 62 families are so absolutely incredibly wealthy. And it's continuing until something is done about it. So you can understand why I take the subject so seriously.
I'll ask you one final question. I know our time is up. And on that theme, I've often thought that Bitcoin was kind of an evolutionary monetary response to this kind of regime, that if Bitcoin hadn't existed, we'd have to invent it because it's an inelastic currency that can't be created at will, that's cryptographically sound and can't be double spent and can't be bailed in by politicians or confiscated. Have you been following that at all, and do you have any thoughts around it?
Not closely enough to comment, but I'm leery of all of the electronic money because, and I know that the Fed recently has endorsed Bitcoin in a sense, and this is because they know that change is coming, but they don't know what change. They know that something has to happen, and so what they want to do is to go to a cashless society so that they will have absolute total control, ultimately, over every government and every person on the planet. And so if they didn't like you, they would just cut off your money from the bank account by some little glitch, and you would have no access to it. You'd probably lose your house, you'd lose your car, and you'd lose your bank account, and it wouldn't be just a joke. It would be the way things are done, and still they are already in some places, but it become even more prevalent under those circumstances, and it would fit in with the plans of the New World Order, as we call it, to establish a world government of them, by them, and for them, in which they had complete control, and in which some of them were very rich, and the rest of us would just work like slaves, and in fact be debt slaves. And as long as we did exactly as we were told, we would get a little money for it and be able to cash it in from our accounts. But if we ever got out of line, goodbye us. And it's a terrible thought. And I just hope that we can reintroduce the concept of cash reserve requirements to banks immediately before it's too late and before we wind up with a cashless society, because that is the only way that democracies and the people will have any say as to what happens in their own affairs. It's the only way that we can retain any kind of genuine government of, by, and for the people.
Okay. And we know that, there's all kinds of initiatives driving pretty hard to the hoop to eliminate cash. So we can leave it there. I want to thank you for your time. And I'll just mention to follow your work on the web. It's paulhellyerweb.com. We should have the audio book out, which will be available on audible.com and the iTunes store sometime in March of 2017. And you can always check out our catalog at the website, SpokenTome.media, one of those newfangled top-level domains. Mr. Hellyer, thanks again for your time today.
It's my pleasure, and my very best wishes to you and your undertaking. I got a letter, an email from someone this last week asking if any of my books were in audio, and I said there was one coming, and so I promised to let her know when it's ready, and so you've got one sale.
Great, we're pretty close. So between her and my mom, it's 2 sales. Okay. All right, thanks a lot. Have a great day.
Okay. You too. Bye.